All right, so my opponent maintains that closed book testing is necessary to keep our student population, in essence, sharp mentally. I'll begin with their on-case argument, their disadvantage. Requiring all educational testing to be open book will decrease aptitude within the nation and lead to lower GDP. Subpoint A. Closed book testing leads an individual to perform better in school. My opponent, subpoint 1. A study done by the National Library of Medicine explored the results of closed versus open book testing in university. There were better results for the closed book group in a test in the 8th week and in the final exam than there were for the open book group. Now, to this, I have two responses. The study my opponent is citing only includes 2 college courses, with 46 students showing up to the first quiz and 51 to the second quiz. Obviously, for legislation that might sweep across the entire United States, the sample size is too small and much more research is needed to make definitive statements. Next, my opponent's argument is that requiring educational testing to be open book will decrease aptitude within the nation and lead to lower GDP due to his claim that closed book testing leads an individual to perform better in school. However, he fails to make clear how exactly performance in school is a good measure of overall aptitude in life, and exactly how closed book testing will lead to a better GDP. His claims are simply unsubstantiated, and the only study he cites has a sample size of 100 compared to the millions in the United States. Next, his on-case arguments. He says, Google is not as quick as you think because of the need to sort between credible and non-credible information. My opponent then cites Wikipedia as an example of a non-credible source that, obviously, as we know, anyone online can edit. As for that argument, everyone knows that Wikipedia is not a reliable source of information. This is a basic fact I myself learned in 4th grade. Next, according to my opponent, a Stanford study suggested students are not good at sorting information online. It says that just because they're savvy with social media, it does not mean that they're good at sorting information well and being discerning. This I'll give you. However, I would argue that this is not a failing on the part of the student, but rather a failing on the part of the school system. Our schools need to be preparing students to face the cultural context in which they exist. And guess what? The internet exists, and it is useful. In this age, our school systems need to be teaching our students how to navigate the internet and how to easily find credible information. Our students' current inability to successfully use the internet does not mean that we should give up trying. The internet is infinitely valuable, and we cannot let it go to waste because of how our students are currently able to navigate it. We need to teach them. Next, in response to my claim that closed book testing would add unnecessary stress to already stressed students, my opponent states that the open books per se in our pockets 24/7 are the source of stress. He cites a study saying, and I quote, social media and mobile devices may lead to psychological and physical issues such as eye strain, difficulty focusing on important tasks, and they may also contribute to depression. The study states that the overuse of technology may also have a more significant impact on developing children and teenagers. So, during cross-examination, I asked my opponent if his source controlled for how the technology was being used, because obviously technology does not have strictly one use. I asked this because he said specifically, and again, I quote, social media and mobile devices may lead to psychological and physical issues. He said those words, social media may cause those issues. Now, of course, I am not arguing for the increased use of social media. We all know how harmful it is. I am arguing for us to utilize the internet as the educational powerhouse it truly is. I asked if his study researched whether the use of social media had different effects than using the internet for educational purposes. In response to this, he said, the source study was for the general use of technology and its effects on an individual, like eye strain and sleep problems. He then goes on to say, whether screen time was for educational purposes or non-educational purposes, the fact remains the same that a closed book testing environment would help prevent these issues described. However, the study he cited was researching social media. What he's arguing has nothing to do with what his source researched. It's actually in direct contradiction to what he said initially in his first video. Again, I will repeat. He specifically said that the study explored social media and technology's effects on students, not merely technology in general. His response to my cross-examination contradicts what he initially said, stating that the source study was for the general usage of technology. But in the initial video, he explicitly states it researched social media. Therefore, this source is shady at best. My opponent is contradicting himself. And overall, his point is not applicable to the point I am trying to make, that the educational usage of technology and the internet is absolutely needed and beneficial to our society. Next, my opponent cites an article from collegemarker.com, which is a resource for finding colleges in Karnataka, a state in southwest India, in which David Callahan, a man with no obvious credentials, argues that the reason why college students cheat is because they are, quote, pressed for time, unquote, and that students resort to cheating due to a lack of time. Now, when I asked my opponent in cross-examination whether or not removing the need to study long hours would ameliorate the specific issue of being, quote-unquote, pressed for time, he dodged around my question by saying long hours is ambiguous. However, I think I am perfectly clear in what I mean, and most of us could agree. One needs to study much longer for a closed book test than they do an open book test, a very basic fact. Therefore, removing the need to study for a closed book test removes the issue of being pressed for time that my opponent says spurs students to cheat. Finally, my opponent then finishes his argument by saying that it is not always advantageous to retrieve a lot of information online than to be able to memorize smaller amounts of information. He then goes on to cite the example of CPR. Now, my opponent takes low-hanging fruit here. He constructs a straw man fallacy by saying, I believe that it is fine to Google how to do CPR in the moments rather than truly learn it. Now, my resolution is that educational testing should be open book. Educational testing refers to elementary schools, high schools, colleges, and universities. The example my opponent gives is that he would be distraught if his child died because a teacher didn't memorize CPR and that she had to Google it in the moment. However, teachers don't learn CPR from university. CPR training happens in independent programs, for example, the Red Cross. I'm not arguing that CPR should be a quick Google, how do we do it? That's not how it works. Clearly, we need to be able to memorize some stuff. I'm not arguing that CPR is something that we can Google in the moment, and it has nothing to do with my resolution. Educational testing should be open book. To me, while CPR is something you learn, it's not educational testing, which again involves kindergarten, elementary school, middle school, high school, college, university. They're not the same thing, and I have effectively deconstructed my opponent's straw man fallacy. Thank you.